10 past, and I know Tony's got a lot to go through, so we'll give him an extra minute, give him 21 minutes. But this is the fifth and final one of this series in the BECi 2020 series. We've endeavoured to go through a number of the issues that are challenging us, and this final one, which is really looking at education in the built environment. There you've got 6 building surveyors. I'm sure Tony will talk about this. So I took another 6 of those building surveyors around that very site this morning, and there's, when was that, 7 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago?
No, it was about a month ago.
A month ago. It's amazing how much has already happened in that site in the past 4 weeks. But without further ado, let me hand over to Tony.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Well, it's convenient that Rob has introduced me, because this talk is really about the whole BECi initiative and the impact that it has on higher education, in particular what we are doing to respond to the various initiatives that are taking place. And in fact, yesterday, Rob, who's a tweeter, as am I, he tweeted he's expecting fireworks from me. And I was sort of put on the spot by that. He later explained that it's a reference to an article that was in Building magazine just a couple of weeks ago by the engineer Chris Wise, which he concluded with the words, "I hope for fireworks." And as we shall see later on, because I'll actually refer to this article in my presentation, he's promoting the idea of new models for built environment education. But let's take it back a little bit and talk about the context. If you go right back to the very first presentation in this series, this BECi series, which was by Martin, Martin explained the principles and the drivers behind the government's construction strategy. And one of the key objectives of the government's construction strategy is what they refer to as an integrated supply chain. And that quote is taken directly from the document. Designers and constructors work together to develop an integrated solution that best meets the required outcome. An admirable objective. I think everyone can subscribe to that. What's that got to do with the current models of built environment education that we have? Well, in order to explain why I think it's relevant, I'm going to quote you from a few reports from industry leaders and from government-sponsored committees. We educate in very narrow silos. They come out of university with preconceived ideas. Courses have become too specialised, too narrowly focused on meeting the short-term industrial needs rather than educating people for a career in the built environment. And lastly, the relationship between those responsible for design and construction should be improved through common education. So there's recognition of these issues. But what's interesting is to look at when those reports were actually published. That last one came from the Banwell report in 1964. The second one came from a report that was sponsored by the O'Barrett Foundation in 1998, Interdisciplinary Skills for Built Environment Professionals. And the first one I put up came from Peter Rogers when he was chair of the Strategic Forum for Construction back in 2002. So clearly there is recognition. And if you look at the built environment disciplines, if we speak very broadly, obviously there is the discipline of architecture, the design-based disciplines. There is an overlap with the engineering disciplines. There's a whole range of disciplines concerned with technology, with the management of the production process, with the management of the commercial aspects of construction. And there are various other built environment disciplines, those concerned with property, planning, infrastructure, with facilities management. And if you want any evidence of just how fragmented the built environment is, you only have to look at the Construction Industry Council. Look at the constituent bodies that make up the Construction Industry Council. Here's just a selection. This is just 12 of over 30 full members of the Construction Industry Council, the professional bodies that perhaps we most obviously recognise. Now, is that a problem? Well, people do think it is a problem. A couple of years ago, the Innovation and Growth team produced a report about low-carbon construction. Paul Morrell, who was at the time the government's construction advisor, was quoted as saying that it's scarcely possible that the innovation and change that is essential can be secured through the industry as it's currently structured and in the silo-based habits of the industry's institutions. That's quite a damning sort of view of the structure of the industry. So throughout all of these things, what we see is constant references to specialisation, to silo mentality, to a narrow focus, to people having preconceived ideas. And as I say, it's all about this fragmentation. So I thought it'd be interesting just briefly to examine how this has come about. Look at it from a historical perspective. And to understand it, you really have to go back to the 18th century, because up until that time, construction was largely based on a medieval model that was built around the guilds of craftsmen. So if you were a client who wanted a building, you would go direct to each of the crafts guilds that were required to construct that building. So you would perhaps employ a carpenter or a plasterer, or all of the different trades and crafts that you needed, and you would employ them all directly. But in the 18th century, that model started to break down, largely because of the increasing need for more complex buildings. And so what we started to see was the increasing use of an intermediary who sat between the client and the various craftsmen and tradesmen. Now initially, that intermediary would have been a master craftsman, but gradually the role of the architect in this intermediary position started to sort of take hold. If you move into the 19th century, as buildings became even more complex, very, very complex military buildings were required. The Industrial Revolution produced the need for factories and mills and so on. And so the role of the architect took on even more importance, and there was an increasing separation between the design function and the construction function. And as methods of procurement started to change, there was the emergence of what was initially known as the measurer, the forerunner to today's quantity surveyor. And we also saw the growth of general contracting. So rather than having to deal separately with each of the different trades, a general contractor would take on that role and would employ them as subcontractors. But what's particularly significant during this period is the establishment of professional institutions. And it was really during this period, the early and towards the sort of latter half of the 19th century, that these gentlemen's clubs, because essentially that's what they started as, gentlemen's clubs in London, to share ideas, to network, as we would call it today, sometimes as study organisations. But you can see where they emerged from. The Institution of Civil Engineers still carries that title. 1834, the Institute of British Architects, now the RIBA. 1834 also, the Builders Society, which is now the Chartered Institute of Building. And 1868, the Institution of Surveyors, which is now the RICS. So in effect, from that point on, this fragmentation became institutionalised, fixed within the industry. So there was a degree of, I suppose, protectionism, because everyone's trying to, put boundaries around their own roles, their own professional responsibilities. How did that impact on education then? Well, to look at the growth of built environment education, we really need to turn to the 20th century. Because from a very early stage, the end of the 19th and early 20th century, the disciplines of architecture and engineering became established in the universities. There were professors of architecture, professors of, say, civil engineering in the universities. So from the earliest days, these disciplines had a seat in the early universities. Contrast that, though, with the more sort of general disciplines associated with surveying and building. Because you wouldn't have found these in the late 19th century, early 20th century universities. The tradition for education in these fields was largely part-time. You learned primarily on the job, and then you went perhaps to evening classes, and you studied to sit professional examinations. The examinations of the Institute of Building, or the examinations of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. So they only really came to the university sector quite late in the day. It was really only in the 1970s that we started to see the emergence of degrees in building, in surveying and so on. And they really only started to grow, I would suggest, during the 1990s. But throughout this entire period, what's interesting to note is that all of the disciplines, whether it's architecture and engineering in the universities or the other disciplines such as surveying and building, studying part-time, the professional bodies are exerting significant control over the curriculum that students are studying. So it's really no wonder then that by the time we get to the present day, we have a set of models for the various disciplines in the built environment which effectively reflect the fragmented nature of the construction and built environment professions. And we still have, I would suggest, a curriculum which is heavily influenced by the professional bodies through the process of accreditation. If you want your degree course accredited, then you have to demonstrate that it fulfills the expectations of the professional bodies. So what's the answer then? What do we actually do about this? Well, one approach would be to acknowledge that there is considerable scope for greater commonality in the education, training, and continuing professional development of the construction professions. This quote was taken from another report, a report known as Crossing Boundaries, produced by Derbyshire and Andrews. It was a report on the state of commonality in the education and training of the construction professions. When was that produced? 20 years ago. That was the starting point for the investigations which led to the report. Let me just show you a couple of the findings that emerged from that report, though. Firstly, there is no support for the concept of a common 3-year degree for all construction professions. And perhaps saddest of all, one of the contributors to the report said this: what's the point of educating rounded people for an industry full of square adversarial roles? This was reinforced by the Latham agenda. Everyone's heard of the Latham report, or I suspect most people have heard of the Latham report, a major report from the early 1990s, I think it was published in 1994. Out of the Latham agenda, a whole bunch of working groups were established to look at different facets of the agenda associated with the Latham report. One of those looked at education, and it was chaired by a former dean from here, Michael Romans. He actually chaired the Working Group 9, which produced this report. This is what they concluded. Propositions which use the concept of a general built environment degree programme will be viewed with scepticism by academics, and unavailable evidence will be heavily undersubscribed. So, not much hope there then, I would suggest. So we're still stuck then with these built environment disciplines. And what those reports really seemed to focus on was the increasing separation, particularly between architecture and engineering. They suggested that there was a noticeable shift in schools of architecture to see architecture as more as a fine art, and in engineering to see it more as an applied science with an emphasis on mathematics. But even if you look at the other disciplines, look at the disciplines associated with technology, with management, with the commercial aspect, look at our programme here. Look at the fragmentation that exists there. We've got 5 separate degree courses just to cover that aspect of it. So we're not even talking about the architecture, all the engineering disciplines. There is really major fragmentation. Why? What are the barriers to this? And there are some significant barriers. Firstly, go back to the professional bodies. Of those professional bodies I listed earlier on, all of those circled ones, accredit degrees in this school. They all have different expectations. We have to demonstrate to the professional bodies that we are meeting those expectations. Secondly, employers. Many employers will express a preference for graduates who come from professionally accredited courses because they want their employees to become professionally qualified. Students know that, or prospective students know it, so they will be naturally attracted to professionally accredited courses because they will perceive that as providing them with better employment prospects. And that means that universities will not be particularly inclined to take any risks with the status quo because it might affect student recruitment. So does that mean that we're just stuck with this now? Well, possibly not. If we look ahead, there are a number of possible drivers for change. Firstly, I think learning and teaching is changing. There is a move away from traditional sort of didactic teaching towards more focus on active student learning. Students actually getting involved. There's now much less emphasis on just acquiring knowledge and more emphasis on creativity, on problem solving, using judgment, collaborating with one another, and coping with change, coping with a constantly changing environment. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we have to recognise that the new tuition fee regime is going to have an impact. Students will demand more, quite rightly, if they're paying that sort of level of tuition fees. So universities will have to respond. But there are some external drivers as well. The low carbon agenda. This is the report that was produced a couple of years ago by the government. But yesterday in the budget, the government actually renewed its commitment to the 2016 date for zero carbon for new homes. They haven't actually outlined how they're going to achieve it yet, but the headline commitment is there. Now, if we are going to achieve that low carbon agenda, there really will be a need for innovation. And perhaps, as Rob spoke in his presentation a few weeks ago, the whole low carbon sustainability agenda can provide a catalyst for new ways of working. I've already made reference to the government construction strategy, which, as I said, Martin introduced in his presentation, the idea of promoting collaboration in the industry, developing new procurement models, and as Adam said in his presentation, promoting the idea of an intelligent client. And of course, we have, for the first time, the technology which will really foster a spirit of collaboration. It will allow collaboration to take place much more easily, and it's becoming increasingly achievable even for small organisations. Now, potentially, I think that BIM could provide a platform for a rethink of built environment education. And that takes us back to the Chris Wise article, because he talks about the need to defragment engineering and architecture, to bring well-integrated, contextually aware technological knowledge into play from the start of every building design. He talks about the need for a new educational model. What sort of model are we looking at? Well, I'm going to just briefly show you a model that I've seen in another country. Last year, myself and Colin and Virginia were fortunate enough to visit Denmark, and we went to the small town of Horsens in Denmark, where VIA University College is located. Now, they have a very interesting program there that they offer. It's a degree that is delivered entirely in English to students from all over Europe, and it's a Bachelor of Architectural Technology and Construction Management. The interesting thing about it is delivered over 7 semesters, one of which is spent in industry gaining experience. But the periods that are spent in the university, they don't do modules, they do projects. So in each semester, the students work in groups on one project and one project alone. It starts off with very simple domestic construction, works its way through multi-storey buildings, conversions, renovations, and so on. And they still have lectures, there is still theory input from the staff, but the majority of the focus of each of the projects that they do is the students working together to solve problems collaboratively. There's nothing, no sort of question of identifying who's the quantity surveyor, who's the architect, who's the construction manager. It's the students working together. And from what we saw, it is very, very successful. Now, the content of that programme is broadly the same as what we have, certainly in the undergraduate construction studies programme. I know that there's still architecture, there's still the engineering disciplines, but there is a huge amount of collaborative working, cooperative working within that programme. And you can see, if you look at the sort of areas of competence that they claim to produce graduates with, it's not just design, there's all the technology there, there's the financial, commercial aspects, there's the production management aspects, and I think perhaps it could provide us with a potential model if we were looking forward. So the opening question was, are we fit for purpose? Well, I would suggest that maybe we are fit for the purpose of built environment education as it was, but perhaps not for built environment education as it needs to be in the future. And really that's where BECi comes in, because the whole BECi initiative is about promoting this idea of collaboration and integration. And we've come up with this idea of looking at the life cycle of a building, not in linear terms, but in a sort of an infinite cyclical term. So looking at it through the design and production stages, but then through the occupation stages, and then later in the life of the building when decisions have to be made about whether we adapt the building, whether we extend it and convert it, or whether we dispose of the building. So the whole idea, as I said, of the BECi initiative is that we seek to get everyone involved. It is a truly sort of collaborative exercise, and that's what we want to use to, not just for research purposes, but to develop our curriculum as well. So, thank you very much.
Martin wins in the 20 minutes presentation, so well done on that one. Thanks for that, Tony. I think there was a few fireworks in there. I'm not sure that everybody wants to hear the message that Tony's putting out there, but let's open it up to questions. Who would like to start off?
When can we do it?
Well, I mean, amongst the BECi team, we discussed the possibility of working towards the next course review as a point at which we perhaps should be looking at introducing the new way of working.
I think that was a fantastic summary. Thank you very much for it. Does that history mirror itself in other European or world, that evolution of what you call fragmentation?
I don't think it does, because if you look at the structure of the industry in other countries, there doesn't seem to have been that the same degree of fragmentation, and I don't think that the industry perhaps became so specialised at an early stage in other countries. So no, I don't think it does.
So does that concept, does education in other was the European countries, let's say, mirror ours still? Is it still?
No, I mean,
as much as ours?
in most of mainland Europe, there seems to be recognition of the disciplines of architecture, obviously, and of engineering, and very little in between. But I mean, Colin, you know more about the one in the industry in Germany, for example, through your work with Linda, but that seems to be the case.
I think the Danish thing, we found that they were still teaching architecture as a separate still.
Yes.
Yes, but they're very design orientated, you know, very
Yeah.
similar to us.
I mean, in Denmark, they have a discipline that's known as the constructing architect.
Yeah.
And the constructing architect would really have the, I suppose the equivalent here, the closest equivalent here would be a combination of the construction manager, the architectural technologist, the quantity surveyor, rolled into one. They don't have that same degree of specialisation. They still have architects who would be responsible for the concept design, and then they would hand it over to a constructing architect who would do everything from there on in terms of developing the working drawings and taking it forward through the sort of production stages. So that's what that course is modelled on.
The Danish model, it sounds here really very exciting. Are there students going out and getting jobs? Does it need re-educating employers?
Well, I think one of the strands that we discussed amongst the BECi team is the need not just for academic research and not just for curriculum development, but also for engagement with industry to find out, you know, we make assumptions that this is what employers want, but it could well be that when we talk to employers, that they're quite happy to accept these more sort of rounded graduates who come from a course which is more collaborative. So I think that would be part of our ongoing agenda, really.
The other interesting thing about Denmark is that they integrate professionals in the examination process, in setting the work, so that when they present their work, they present it not just to the academics. They have teams
That's right,
of externs.
So how do they actually get assessed?
Huh?
How do they get assessed?
Well,
Do they do exams?
They don't do exams. I'll tell you how they get assessed, and this is probably where the students that are here might get a little bit scared about this, but the students work in groups throughout the whole project. Now, we know from our experiences in running group projects that there's a tendency for students within groups to specialise. So they only take responsibility for that bit of the project which they've had to deal with. Our understanding from talking to the staff at BECi was that each student has to make an individual presentation to a panel of staff and external visitors from industry. And they can be quizzed on any aspect of the project. So they have to engage throughout the project with all aspects of it. Because if they don't, the only assessment they have is that presentation. There's no exam, there's no written work. It is purely based on the presentation which students make to the panel at the end. So it's intense pressure and a lot hinges on it, but it certainly makes them focus.
How were the presentations?
Well, we didn't see any of the presentations, but we do know that they do this kind of thing, but they back it up with all of the drawings, all of the costings, etc. Yeah. So it looks comprehensive.
I mean, as I say, they have to bring in all the sort of course team and visitors from industry, and they set aside, I don't know, I guess a whole week, I would think, just to do those presentations.
Is it worth exploring jointly validated courses? I mean, I know at Sheffield there's an engineering and architecture degree that's sort of validated by both accredited bodies.
By both RIBA and the civil engineers? Or?
Yeah, civil engineers. Yeah. And is that just more complication, or is that kind of?
Well, I mean, my only experience was of this type of thing was in a previous institution I worked at. And in fact, I worked there with Martin at Luton, and they tried to introduce a program at Luton where architects were actually going to be educated together with construction managers and quantity surveyors, and it was going to be the future. And it was really through the influence of the professional bodies that it became impossible, because the RIBA were expecting everything to be delivered through design studios, but then you went to the CIOB or the RICS and they were expecting a certain level of content, and it just became impossible. I mean, would that be your expression, your experience of it as well, Mark?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's nice in principle, but when it comes to the reality of dealing with the professional bodies, I think that there needs to be a change of mindset amongst those people as well.
Yeah. I mean, no, I mean, they always say that, I mean, the RBA, they always claim, in education, they always claim that they are open to discussions about new ways of, new models and what have you. I don't know, maybe it's just worth at least having a conversation.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I'm all for that.
One of the problems with integrating engineering into any other thing is that engineering is governed by European requirements, and therefore it is full of maths and science and thermodynamics, whatever it is, fluid dynamics. And if you do architecture, you will tend to come, even if you do it with engineering, you come out either as an architect or as an engineer, because you can't do both at the time. So I think this model would be best, at least at the beginning, the best approach would be to look at the other areas that we do. And that is that great mass of RICSs, and see it that way, and then see how successful that can be.
You know, I wasn't suggesting that, I was just saying that engineering one, I know that exists, but I know we don't have a civil engineering department there anyway, but I mean...
But if you go to Bath, where it's famous for its architecture and engineering, it actually turns out they're not engineers. They're not recognised as, chartered engineers.
Architects in there or IBM or something. What? No.
Yeah, thanks. It's really great and very stimulating. And on the screen there, we've got collaboration and integration. If it's such a great idea, which it clearly is in many people's minds, it must be a win-win situation. In that case, what are the implications? If it's a win-win situation, then surely everybody would be going for it. Why are the institutions then resisting it? Is it not a win-lose situation? If some people win, some people lose. What's the argument there?
I think from the institution's perspective, they're all competing with each other, and they're big businesses now, aren't they? The RICS is a global organisation with 120,000, 140,000 members or something, and a huge turnover which runs to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds each year. So they won't want to do anything which affects their position, and they will all see themselves as the principal contact within the industry, and they won't want to give up anything which affects their status. So I think that the institutions are perhaps at the root of it.
Well, I think an answer to that as well. To some extent, it's not always about conflict between the institutions. There's a thing about excellence, design excellence, in all those levels that the institutes are there to promote. Actually, I think the Britain has produced excellence in architecture and design. We have it fantastic, and we have excellence in engineering. Now, what in the end you're going to have to fight against is that balance between cooperation, which I'm absolutely for, as you know, because I'm supporting that mix, but also not to lose the astonishing excellence that we have. I can talk, I think about it as a designer, a little bit as an engineer too, we have that. So you have to balance those two things out. It's not always about people's, you call it fragmentation, it could also be called specialisation. Certainly, we need to be, I think, dealing with both things.
I mean, I think that fragmentation and specialisation are perhaps two sides of the same coin, but as you say, there's a balance there somewhere.
Well, that's where the kind of construction things at the centre of it could be thing that kind of connects the two, because that isn't always so excellent in terms of the way that things are executed, or certainly from the perspective of the designer, or they're removed from the process of construction. That isn't good. That isn't, you know, there's not a good argument for that. So I think the idea of making that better, I'm actually kind of
Well, as I say, that could be our starting point, and then that provides the bridge then to some further developments down the line.
I think what you said about no company wants to give up their status. I think that's what it boils down to. If you've got something, if you've got something good, you're not going to want to give it up unless you can exchange it for something better. I'm not too sure what is better, but from a student's perspective, I think that I like the Danish model. But the only thing I didn't like was that what you said about the presentations as an assessment. So I don't think it would be fair that it all comes down to 10 minutes, because some people might not be able to do as well on like 10 minutes in like a 10-minute assessment as opposed to like a written assessment or something.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to go down that sort of route, we wouldn't necessarily have to slavishly follow the Danish model, but it would be a model as a starting point, and then we would have to sort of, you know, look at the overall assessment processes to make sure that we are assessing all of the learning outcomes associated with what we want to achieve.
I think if the first year was more like theory-based, then it'd give everyone like a more level playing field, that everyone would have a knowledge base of the industry, and then maybe second and third year can be more like project.
I'm not convinced about that. I mean, we could go on all day about this, but I think that as soon as if you embed a culture in the first year of the course, then it's very difficult for students to actually get out of that in the second year. If they become used to a theory-based course in the first year, they will really rail against any deviation from that model in the second year, in my opinion. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that.
That's what we do at the moment, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're the architect students here. Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that, because they get trained early on to have to stand up and make public presentations. It's part of the crit system is part of our thing. And some people really don't enjoy it and never really get used to it. And I think that's a fair point, that you need to be able to do both. Some people are happier presenting, putting paper in, than having to stand up in that way. So it's very fair.
Sorry, yeah, I'm a part-time student, and I think I've benefited immensely from being in the situation when I study and work. It's been fantastic. How does the Danish system incorporate part-time students?
Well, that's a very good point, actually, because when I've been, you know, this has been going over in my mind, that we have a very strong part-time element to our programme, and I think that the Danish model works primarily with full-time students who are going to be in, you know, 3 or 4 days a week probably working on these projects. I don't think it works in the same way for part-time students, and my initial view on that would be that we would have to maintain a part-time route separate and perhaps delivered under a different process. But I think you've hit a very personal point there.
Yeah, I think it's been a fantastic experience, and something that you should really keep.
Yeah.
And whatever form it transpires to be.
I'll be interested to hear the views of other students on that Danish model, how they would respond to it.
Yeah, and don't be fooled. It's not 10 minutes. Do you know what I mean? It's they get lots of time.
It's more fairly assessed.
And yeah. You know,
I think the model makes well, when you work in a group, or when I work in a group throughout this course, you always have people who perform, people who don't perform. People who perform always carry the people who don't perform, and they perform better than they do, but only because of the work that you do. So basically, I think that if they could do this personal communication and be involved in the whole thing,
Yeah.
it would promote, more fairness.
I mean, you've obviously, I'd say virtually every student I speak to has had bad experiences of working in a group, and you know we are very conscious of those. But when you have a good experience of working in a group, it is the best experience, is it not? It is the best learning environment.
And the other thing you would say is that with this process of having to present the entire package, then from the very beginning, people realise they can't just let other people do the work. Okay? So as Tony was saying, you've embedded a culture at the start point where they know they're there to work, you know, and to play an active role. So it has all sorts of potential, you know, very interesting group dynamics. And they spend a lot of time working on how the groups work.
No. You want to say that? I made that, sorry. I made that mistake 2 weeks ago. Just say it again.
In view of the role of the institutions, going back to that in a way, and the fragmentation of the industry, so what is the best way forward, and the conflicts of interest, what is the best way forward in order to achieve this collaboration in Europe?
Well, I know it's easy to say, but in many fields, universities lead rather than follow. You know, rather than just respond to what's happening, they actually set the agenda. And sometimes I just think that universities have to sort of take the high ground on this and say, this is what we want to do. We've gone out, we've spoken to employers. This is what employers are expecting. This is a better way of doing things. Take it or leave it.
You could expand with a Melbourne.
Yeah, I mean, in Australia, there was a decision taken by the University of Melbourne that across the entire university, at undergraduate level, they would offer one undergraduate program in each faculty, one. And there would be specialisation within that. So, as far as the built environment was concerned, and at Melbourne, the faculty is not dissimilar to the school here. There's architecture, planning, construction, urban design. So there's a lot of very similar disciplines, but they have one undergraduate program, and then the specialism takes place at postgraduate level. Now, Melbourne is in a slightly different environment in the sense that they attract very, very high achieving students. You know, they are. It will be the equivalent of a top Russell Group university where they can attract the very best. So even though the specialisation doesn't take place until postgraduate level, they will still get students wanting to go there. Other Australian universities, they still maintain their specialism at undergraduate level. But again, it's an example of a university actually saying this is the way we're going to do it, not just following slavishly what the institutions are expecting.
Okay, that is the 20 minutes of questions. You have the first one, you can have the last one. As long as it's as quick as the first one.
I might throw the cat amongst the pigeons here by saying, going back to the chartership, the professional bodies, the accreditation, how can I put this diplomatically? I can't, so I'm just going to be blunt and say that amongst those professional bodies, one stands out as a coveted title, and that is the title of architect and associated with our IBA. I'm just wondering, does that go some way to not allowing the compromise with other institutions? Is it because there's a coveted title attached to the RIBA?
That's a misunderstanding, or it's a misnomer. The RIBA no longer construct. We don't have to. No architect has to be registered with the RIBA.
Yeah.
We have a different accreditation body called ARB, the Architects Registration Board, which I have, in order to practice, I have to be registered with ARB. And no longer since, have to be, I don't have to, unless I decide to pay the annual subscription to the RIBA, I don't have to be.
The only thing that's protected is actually the title. So if I just said, if I'm not qualified as an architect and I call myself an architect, I could be prosecuted, but I can still do everything that an architect can do, but I just either call yourself an architectural designer or an architectural or whatever it is. So it's an odd...
But it's a very good question, because only yesterday in our practice we were having a conversation about our website, which all architects do, and where you put our, where you put RIBA, why do you put RIBA? I said, they said, well, the perception of the public is, and if you haven't got that RIBA up there, you're not an architect sort of thing. So your perception is exactly what we all suffer from, if you like. So I think it's a very good place to, but don't worry about it. We've done it.
Yeah, that's
Did it?
Okay.
I mean, part of the question would be, if you're coming out and you've got the skills to use the latest technology and stuff like that, and can command a higher salary, but you don't have the title, what do you want? Yeah? And I think that potentially, if you look at some of the graduates that are coming out that can use the latest technology and stuff like that, that are able to command a much higher salary, then maybe there's something in that, because that potentially goes away with that. But what Pete's saying is absolutely right. Half the challenge here is if you're going to set yourself up as an independent, yeah, and wanting to sell your services, then you obviously have to project something that the bigger wider world recognise and acknowledge. So,
Fair enough.
okay.
Oh, very good.
We were going to wrap up, and I did ask David if we could say a few words, and I'm still happy. We started with your video when you were in India, and that's now reached 1 million YouTube views. Did you know that?
I think it's been
Just gone viral.
It's gone viral. Fantastic talk. I'd say a lot, I'll just let you go. And I apologise, there's one I missed. So I'm going to send it down. But I think the initiative is a wonderful contribution to the school. You know, I come to the school as a humble architect. That's a rare breed. As a humble architect, but my family are builders. They always thought, I was strangely in touch with my feminine side and to be an architect. But I thought that was a vote of confidence, really. But come to it as recognising the difference of kind of conversations, either at the dinner table or whatever. And the whole idea of collaboration and integration is about mutual respect. And there's a long ways to go because of the fragmentation and or specialisation. And the litigious environment in which practice operates. And it's a very, very difficult scene. Often on the projects I was sometimes involved with, my brother would be the claims manager, so we sit down and file holding the drawings. So, one's well aware of the problems, and one's not going to change the world overnight. But I think it's incumbent on us all, I think, to harness this time of change which we're all facing in higher education going forward. And we're changing huge change and responsibilities in constructing this better world and so on with depleted resources. Just to start building ways of working, which is common sense. We're talking to each other and mutual respect and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of models that harness what I think is a kind of common sense just way of working together. And part of that respect is about valuing as much the guy or woman who can crack it out on the site and get supply chain working, as it is respecting and valuing what it takes in terms of time to get a maturity about design thinking. And some of the models, I think, that we see, whether it's the Danish model or the Australian model and so on and so on, they kind of circumvent one or two of those things. And I don't think there's a panacea, but I think it's both about specialisation, because that's the world we're living in. I think it's about being hooked in and respecting the tradition of professions, whatever we want to. But going beyond that and working between that ground and what the industry is doing. And I think that this is the space between that I'm interested in. Because we're not going to, I don't think, effect substantial change, which is both negotiate with all the professions, radically change academic structures, because we're like dinosaurs in terms of the speed we can change. But what we can effect is changing that kind of space that is more deregulated, the kind of postgraduate stuff, and the interface with industry. And I think that's where BECi sits very comfortably, and where the kind of talks we've had shed very interesting light on new ways in which we can build those dialogues And maybe the way around it is maybe project phase, maybe introducing other kinds of courses that not only are pan-professional and cross-disciplinary in terms of academic terms, but roping in industry as well, roping in the construction industry as well. I think that's kind of fundamentally important. And I think the area you can do that is this kind of space between academia and industry, which is probably my particular interest, as somebody who's kind of probably worked between the two a little bit. But I'm chuffed that the BECi boys, and ably led by Sue and supported by Jane and whipped into shape in the forthcoming months. We're all looking forward to that by Lucy, and I think there's great potential in this. So I'm delighted it's happening in a small way. And thank you all for attending and supporting it. Look forward to future events. Thanks.